Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itron, COO of PRI, and with me is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. Well, we know that the state's got a big budget crunch in its hands, and depending on who you believe, it could be as much as $70 billion. So now the governor has just come out with a May revise, and our special guest, who is going to analyze the budget, is PRI Senior Fellow in Business and Economics, Wayne Winegarden. So I'll start with the first question. Wayne, Governor Newsom released the May revised budget just this past Friday. Now that you've had some time to review the specifics, what are your initial impressions of the governor's latest budget approach?
The governor, he's so slick, and he likes to wrap things up to make it seem as if he's being fiscally responsible. So, if we're going to give him credit where credit is due, he does talk that there will be no tax increases. He does have some permanent spending cuts, and he has some temporary spending cuts. He's sounding all the right kind of notes about being fiscally responsible. The problem is, as you dig deeper into it, you see that there's a lot of gamesmanship going on. He did that in the January budget, and he's continuing that with the May revise. So there are some things that we need to do more of in terms of the spending cuts, and I'm glad he actually is implementing those, and I'm glad he's saying there's no tax increases. But majority of the spending cuts are one-time. About $20 billion are one-time spending cuts, with the idea that he's going to increase those spending once the crisis, quote unquote, goes away. So that's a problem. And then the amount of fund shifts he's using and games he's doing in order to try to kind of paper over the problem and just kind of hopefully that revenues will recover. There's too much of that going on. So on net, it's not up to the moment. It's better than I had feared, and I'll give him credit for that, but it's still not up to the moment that we're facing.
What struck me, Wayne, when the governor rolled out his January budget was that it wasn't really the path he went down. I thought that was more predictable. But it was more that the major news of it was he decided to pick a fight with the Legislative Analyst's Office over the size of the deficit. That really has carried the budget conversation ever since then. So now that he's rolled out the May revise, how do you rate the governor's deficit projections now? Do you think it's more realistic, or do you think it's more political theater, designed to try to not make the problem what it really is?
It's the latter. It's still political theater. He play again. There's just so many games, and it's buried, and you have to get into all of the wonkish details to actually see them. And I think that's the purpose of it. So your eyes glaze over, and he gets to, quote unquote, be fiscally responsible. I mean, a perfect example, one of the big differences, the LAO now is up to a $73 billion deficit. We haven't seen them evaluate the $17 billion attempt to close the gap that the governor had agreed to. But they were at $73 billion, but originally it was 68. And the governor said it was $38 billion. So there was this big gap. Well, a big part of that gap was that the governor, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, he was going to bring down education spending closer to kind of the minimal amount that we need to spend as part of Prop 98. That's actually, though, something that has to be passed by the legislature. He just kind of picks it under as to be part of the baseline and says, see, look, we got all this expenditure reduction, which is good, and which is something we need to do. We need to be more efficient with our spending and still do a good job. But, we need to rein that spending in. But he's trying to kind of tuck that spending in as something that's been achieved so that he can take credit for it, A, without highlighting it, but B, when we get to the actual budget, this has to be implemented. And if it isn't, then the deficit is actually tens of billions of dollars higher than what the governor was stating. So that, again, is part of the problem. We say, is it political theater? Yes, because when we get into the actual negotiations with the legislature, and that's the stage we're at now. The legislature is going to pass a budget, and then we'll get into negotiation between the legislature and the governor. Those hard decisions can't be kind of papered over, and we need to actually see the will to cut that spending, which we probably won't, and that's going to leave us at a much more difficult deficit that needs to be closed. and that's going to create pressure for all sorts of bad policies.
So the governor says that he is taking a 2-year approach to the state's budget shortfall. But if you look at the deficit the governor projects currently and the budget that he projects the state will have in 2025, the deficit goes up, assuming the May revise is enacted into law. So doesn't that show that the governor's plan doesn't, quote, meet the moment, as he likes to say?
Exactly. He's going to close the deficit, except for he's not going to close it this year. He's going to, still have a deficit next year. That gets to kind of the earlier point. A lot of these are one-time spending cuts because he's hoping, and he has all triggers as part of his budget too, so that if revenues surprise to the upside, we can get all sorts of spending in there. So yeah, from that perspective, it doesn't meet the moment at all. But I guess this is a good thing, which is he's agreeing with us to some extent too by stating this. He's saying that he knows this is a multi-year problem. This is something that's going to be with us for several years, that they required a lot of reductions in spending to actually sustainably address this issue. I mean, something that he hasn't said, right? We're talking about we'll have a huge reduction in spending compared to the current year 2023-2024 budget. And we keep talking about that spending reduction, but we don't talk about it relative to income. And even with his quote unquote spending reductions, if they were implemented, you still would have the budget of the state will have grown faster than the incomes of Californians. So throughout all of this craziness, we're still going to have the state and the size of the state government getting larger compared to the incomes of people in order to pay for that spending. So that, so even with all the cuts, we're still growing government. And I think that is a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about meeting the moment. If we're still growing government relative to our incomes, then we're clearly not meeting the moment.
One of the things that struck me rhetorically watching the governor's press conference is he definitely went to great lengths to show himself as, I'm a quote budget cutter and I'm, dealing with the severity of the moment. He talked about all the spending reductions that he's making in the May revise and talked about things like cutting state administrative spending. And he emphasized he's making over 260 permanent and one-time spending cuts. You just mentioned overall spending cuts, spending isn't being cut enough. But how do you evaluate the spending cuts that he actually proposes to make? Are these reasonable cuts? Could we go further? Will ultimately these types of cuts put us on a more sustainable spending path going forward?
Well, when he likes to, when he's counting up the spending cuts, and that's is an interesting way of doing it, because that makes a spending cut of $1 million of the same value of a spending cut of $1 billion. And obviously, from the deficit perspective, it's so large, we need, real substantive reductions in spending. Again, that I think is part of his positioning of this. Look, we've cut 260 different programs. Yes, but from a size perspective, most of that spending cut is one-time spending. So it's going to be cut this year, but it's going to be coming back. And he said when he was doing his presentation, he was very clear that if he could bring that spending back, he would. So what matters more, kind of going directly to your question, what matters more is the cuts to ongoing spending. And so when he talks about efficiencies and he wants to improve efficiencies, and that is absolutely the right message. And he wants to do, I think it was an 8% reduction in kind of some of the administrative spending, and he wants to get rid of unfilled positions. And those are absolutely the right things to be doing. And that's the type of change that would actually help put the budget on a more sustainable path. The problem is that is not the majority of what he's doing. Part of the position that he's done is they have the $17 billion kind of interim fix with different solutions that was supposed to help. Many of those were budget gimmicks. They were fund shifts. They were, different types of games that you can play with the budget that just paper over the issue, but kind of leave the deficit as a festering problem. Well, he now talks about how much spending reductions he has, kind of just saying, leaving that $17 billion there and not talking about the fund shifts that he's used previously. So, again, that type of, toward your question, is this moving us more towards a sustainable? And the answer is no, because there's not enough of that sustainable changes, and there's too much of those games.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
Not surprisingly, the governor's May revise contains billions of dollars in pauses and shifts and revenue and borrowing. California certainly had a problem with what Jerry Brown called a wall of debt in the past when it over-relied on budgetary borrowing. Does the May revise take us down the same path again?
Yes, it does. We're going to be very vulnerable, and I think we may be talking about a wall of debt in a couple of years because we keep borrowing against the funds that we have, and that is going to end up needing to be repaid. I mean, in the situation that we're in, and we're in a very dire fiscal situation, they're still talking about bonding authority, and we have about, I think the governor estimates about $16 billion of bonding authority. So they want to issue new bonds for housing and global climate change and for schools. So at a moment where we're already can't close the budget, we already have too much debt. Interest rates, mind you, are at long-term highs we haven't seen in good 20, 30 years. And they want to issue more debt to expand spending. It's an incredibly fiscally irresponsible way of addressing these issues. And it sets us up to have this problem where we have all of these high interest payments that are then going to start taking up a large part of the budget. We have all of these kind of repayments to internal accounts that we have to make. And so more and more of the budget is going to be forced into those categories. Mind you, they're not going to want to stop spending on the priorities that the legislature is going to want to. And so we're going to have that pressure for more taxes, more revenues, and all of that is going to compound, I think is the right word. And so we're going to put ourselves in that position, exactly what Jerry Brown called, which is that wall of debt. So we're absolutely on that path. We have not learned from the past crises, and we're putting ourselves in a position where we're going to relive it.
I thought another interesting provision in the May revise involves something that I worked on when I worked for Congresswoman Connie Conway when she was Assembly Republican leader, and that's the Rainy Day Fund. And we have built up a significant reserve in the Rainy Day Fund over the years, but the May revise proposes to use about half of that reserve that's been built up, about $4.2 billion this year and $8.9 billion in 2025-26. So that got me wondering, do you think tapping into the Rainy Day Fund so heavily this year is prudent? And if not, well, really, how should governors and legislative leaders approach tapping into the Rainy Day Fund reserves? When is the right time to do it?
Well, I mean, from a budget kind of crisis perspective, you could certainly argue that this is an appropriate time to be tapping into the rainy day fund because, from a budget perspective, it certainly is raining. The problem is how are you using the rainy day fund? And Tim, you were there, so I don't know if you have any wisdom to add to this, but the rainy day fund is supposed to get us through the difficult times. It's a fiscal or it's a financial bridge that gets us, revenues drop because, there's a business cycle, things happen, whatever the reason, there's a short-term problem, and this can bridge us across that problem so that we can maintain a kind of a fiscally sustainable position And so that kind of those kind of unexpected events don't cut necessary kind of government spending. And that's the point of a rainy day fund. And there's a lot of value to having that. The problem with, we're going to go through the next 2 years now, and we're going to blow through half of the rainy day fund, but we're not setting ourselves up to move to a fiscally sustainable position, which means is that we're going to keep emptying the rainy day fund, but it's going to continue to rain, to go with the analogy. And so that money is going to keep getting spent down, but we're never going to get to a fiscally sustainable position. And then what happens when that fund becomes much smaller or eventually drained, and you still have budget issues? That's the real fear, and that's, to me, the concern about how they're dipping into the fund. Not that this isn't necessarily a time to be using rainy day funds, certainly, but the strategy for using it is going to leave us in a weaker financial position.
Wayne, on that point, that's exactly what I was thinking when reading about what he's proposed with the rainy day fund. The whole point of it is to prevent or lessen the huge blow to core services during a downturn. And if we're using half of it now with a downturn that seems like it's going to last a little while, I don't know. I think you should be a little more judicious in how much you take up front.
No, absolutely. This is a multi-year problem, and we're not preparing for kind of what happens next year and the year after.
So, Wayne, you alluded to this earlier. There's been a lot of talk at the Capitol this spring about putting one or more mega state bond measures on the November ballot to fund projects like school construction or environmental causes or housing. Whether these priorities deserve more funding notwithstanding, do you think it is fiscally responsible for the state to entertain this November, given the deficit? If so, what do you think is an acceptable amount of borrowing lawmakers should consider?
Zero. That's what they should be considering. It's not acceptable. One, interest rates are exceptionally high. I think I mentioned that earlier. So any borrowing you're doing when, 30-year mortgages are at or around or above 7%. So borrowing now is very, very expensive. That is a problem. And so the other problem is, given what we were just talking about, given the rainy day fund that Tim just mentioned, we need all the fiscal flexibility that we can muster. So if we have $16 billion in borrowing capacity, and if we have to use it, we should be using it to ensure that the government can do its essential functions and continue to provide those services, not to expand government spending, because that's just exacerbating this affordability problem that we have. And I think I mentioned this earlier as well, total spending is continuing to grow faster than our incomes. Borrowing and spending that money on current services is just a way of continuing to expand the burden of government in the near term, even though our fiscal position is weak. It's particularly troubling given those kind of trends that we're looking at. The other problem with much of kind of these borrowing that they want to do is that it's debt should be for kind of viable kind of capital purposes and capital that we know works. And the reason why I say it that way is a lot of the new energy infrastructure for global climate change, we don't know for certain that this is actually a good investment. And so, if you have debt on a bad investment, then you're going to have to keep paying that off, even though there's not a real asset there to support it. But that's how we should be using our debt, is towards viable capital purposes. So roads, bridges, natural gas plants, nuclear plants for electricity, those types of things, water infrastructure. These are the value-added public services that are capital investments that you would naturally want to borrow against. And so that would be the other point I want to bring in, the idea that we want to use these for environmental purposes that really aren't going to have kind of that capital return. That in itself is going to be quite troubling, that we want to use it for housing first type purposes. So we're going to overpay for housing that, based on past trends, is going to be degraded very quickly. That's not a good investment. So the reason they want to borrow, there's a concerning issue because the purpose of it is not going to be a long-term useful capital structure. It's going to be either wasted on current services or buying questionable assets.
Well, and I think too, the wake-up call of the bond for homelessness passed in March by just a few thousand votes. So do voters really have an appetite for these sorts of mega bond measures? I think the other thing too is really trust in government. Remember we had the huge water bond in 2014 that had $3 billion in it, the amount that was needed to build two above ground water storage projects. We still haven't turned a shovel on these shovel-ready projects over a decade later. So, whether they're good priorities for bond measures, there's also something to be said for, will the money actually be spent as promised to voters?
Right. We keep asking for, the government keeps asking us to fund more bonds to solve problems that they've been spending so much money on in the past, and they keep asking for more money in the past. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, skin of the teeth. We just spent more money for homeless. So why do we need another bond on homeless? We spend. I saw a great story that we spend enough money. You could fly all of the homeless from California to, I think it was Kansas, and buy them a home in Kansas, and still would be spending less than what we spend here. So the idea that we keep asking for more money and more bonds to do something that we've already funded, hopefully people are beginning to wake up and be concerned by that.
So one of the things that I thought was interesting, and you make this point in your really terrific op-ed that was published on Friday in the Orange County Register, that the governor's plainly stating he's opposed to tax increases this year. But as you say, because we're still growing government, we're still spending more than the state's taking in, we're actually making it more likely that Californians are going to be hit with a painful tax increase in the future. And, kind of looking at how Governor Newsom and the legislature has responded to our budget downturn over the past couple of years, it really reminds me of one of the most painful times we went through, and I think a lot of people have forgotten about, which was the 2009 budget crisis. I see the state kind of going down that same path. So could you paint the picture for us of kind of what was going on back then, and what are the parallels between that budget crisis, that was more than 15 years ago, and kind of what we're going through today?
Yeah, and there are some scary parallels. I mean, the history certainly does rhyme in that way. 2009, we had obviously the housing crisis, so that recession began in December of 2007 and persisted all the way through 2008 into 2009. And that was a barn burner of a recession. And it hit California particularly hard. The real estate markets, our revenues crashed. And what was interesting, and where some of the parallels start to come into play, is you started seeing budget problems actually in 2006, but we didn't address the issues right away. We let them fester, and the problems got worse, and they got worse. And eventually, we got to a point where, one, you were at just a tremendous crisis. You're talking about 45% of the general fund, or something about that level, was the size of the deficit. So you just had this incredibly large problem, and it required a painful choices. I mean, you actually saw an actual 15% reduction in spending, not because the legislature wanted to, but because you had no choice. And you did see some temporary tax increases. Now, we probably should put temporary in quote, because out of that, and then 2012, and we got to the highest marginal income tax rates in the country. That was, it came later, but that certainly kind of blazed the trail for those. So you saw kind of the movement towards eventual painful tax increases, and those were broad-based tax increases, and that led to eventual permanent tax increases because we didn't deal with the budget crisis early enough. We didn't get aggressive early enough, and the crisis just got ahead of us. And so I think there are some parallels. I mean, right now we talk about how, we don't have a housing crisis like we did in 2007, 2008. But we do actually have problems with the commercial property market. This is something the Federal Reserve itself is raising, something that California is particularly susceptible to. And so the extent that these debt on these commercial properties, as they become need to become rolled over, and if they don't, that could be a vulnerability, and that could be a very scary parallel between 2007 and today. We have the highest unemployment rate in the country, and mind you, it's the same rate today as it was in 2000, about 6 months before the 2007 recession began. So there are parallels in our economic situation, which are a bit disconcerting. There's certainly parallels in terms of where our budget is going. And there's parallels in terms of how we're dealing with it. And given the proclivity of the legislature and the governor to want spending to continue to increase, to want to grow the government relative to the size of people's ability to pay those bills, we're going down that same path. We know from the 2009 crisis that the end of that path is a really very, very difficult crisis. It would make today's issues look small in comparison.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
Now that the governor has presented the May revise, the action turns to the legislature. While you've urged the governor to go farther when it comes to making spending cuts, liberals in the legislature have never met a spending increase they didn't like. So how do you predict how they will view the governor's budget plan? And do you think it's realistic that many of these spending cuts have a chance of passing?
I don't think it's realistic that they're going to be spending. One, because he's not, I don't think he's being forceful enough. He's not being honest enough. And he's not looking at permanent increases enough. On top of it, you're getting into areas where the legislature just doesn't want to cut. They don't want to reduce spending on education. They don't want to reduce the spending on the environment. So that desire to spend more is going to it's going to be strong, and so I hope that they don't look towards revenue increases, but I'm not optimistic that if that's where they come, will the governor really draw a line in the sand and defend no tax increases? Certainly from the way he was positioning himself, it seems like he would, but I don't have faith that in the end, in those negotiations, that he wouldn't come to an agreement to raise taxes to keep certain spending, particularly because he wants that spending to occur. So you've already seen some subtle pushback from the legislature in terms of what they would call spending priorities. And so I think that is a risk that's out there. It's something we need to keep talking about, pushing back on, and making clear that if we're going to further increase taxes, we're going to really exacerbate many of the problems that we're seeing in the state. We're going to worsen the outmigration, particularly the outmigration of people with significant income. And remember that half the budget comes from a very, very small slice of the population, and most of the income tax revenues come from that top 0.1%. So if we're going to push those rates even higher, we're going to really see some of the really adverse impacts from those dynamic impacts, and we could actually put ourselves into a worse fiscal position and worsen the deficit. So tax increases are a concern, and we shouldn't take our eye off of that ball.
Well, we had the first evidence of how the liberals in the legislature are going to respond on Friday when Senator Caroline Menjivar, who's on Budget Subcommittee number 3 in the Senate on Human Services, says, The administration's revised budget proposal went even deeper into catastrophic cuts to core human services programs. These are not just administrative cuts. They are the core programs, the governor said, are not being cut. She called them draconian cuts that have real life and death consequences and will push our most vulnerable children, families, and aging Californians into homelessness and starvation. And she's vowed that she is going to fight back with everything she has to protect core services and keep intact the progress we've made for the survival of California's families. So I think if that's a preview of where the legislature is coming from, you're right. The governor has a tough road ahead of him.
Yeah, and I think that's something we need to really not let her define that market. I mean, when you listen to that quote, for public services, well, she's defining things that are so far outside the core. So if we're talking about healthcare, right, and they want to provide healthcare regardless of your immigration status. Now, is that core? Is that a core public service? I think she wants to define that as core public service. I would imagine that most Californians wouldn't define that as core, but more importantly, when you're looking at the trade-offs, is that something we could really afford? And right now, we're looking at the fiscal situation, it's clearly not something that we can afford. So I think pushing back against this idea that, we're not already spending often more than most other states on these services, we're getting less for those outcomes, and that these far too much of spending is going towards non-core services, and the core actually is not the priorities they're saying, and the core is getting short-shrifted. So we need to push back and not let them define what the landscape is, because it's being defined incorrectly.
So as we close, Wayne, you have been writing some terrific analyses of state spending and state spending proposals for our Spending Watch project, which our listeners can check out at pacificresearch.org. And you write a lot in these analyses about what's the affordable level of spending in California. So given all that we've discussed in this podcast and what you've written about the Newsom budget plan, what would a May revise look like if we had a Governor Wayne Winegarden or a Director of Finance Wayne Winegarden? How would you steer the state through a $27 billion or likely larger deficit?
Well, you definitely need to look at things to be more austere, undoubtedly, but you also need to be a gradual. I think that is a very important kind of way of approaching it, that if you become too radical too quickly, you can destabilize things. So we need to actually understand and define what is the affordable amount of spending, which to me, if you just look at where the average has been, it's been about 7% of our personal income. Now we've been well over 8% and kind of going to crazy levels. But we need to, through broad-based control over spending, through making very difficult choices, by bringing education spending down to where the Prop 98 minimum is, but demanding higher efficiencies, we can both achieve those core public goals that we need to be doing, but doing it for less. I mean, whether you're talking about homeless, where we've done a great deal of research that shows you can do twice as much by spending half as much. We need to implement those types of programs, and we need to do it methodically. We need to counter this idea that we're not spending enough. When you look at every metric, we spend more than every other state and receive less for what we spend. And I think that needs to be over many years. This is not just something that can be fixed in 1 year, but over time, we need to start benchmarking our spending, and we need to align our spending with a much more affordable level, and then demand that we do better with less. And if you look at the outcomes in nearly every other state, that's not a difficult goal to achieve. Our spending is so ineffective that just getting to average would yield tremendous results in terms of a more affordable government with more effective government services. And so that would be the focus. There's all sorts of all sorts of spending efficiencies to gain on homelessness. There's all sorts of efficiencies out there in education, on when you're talking about the environment, when you're talking about winding down wasteful projects like the train to nowhere. I mean, the savings are out there, but we need a longer term methodical kind of approach that has a kind of target of what are we working towards? What's the affordable amount of government spending, and then just demanding the efficiencies to get there.
Thanks so much, Wayne. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll definitely be staying on top of this issue. So please look out for more podcasts, more op-eds on California's budget crisis. Thanks again. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.